Has spoken to us before, and you may hear him from time to time when he's being interviewed on national radio or television. Robert is one of the Universities of Otago's inaugural sesquicentennial distinguished chairs and a professor of international relations. He served as an editor for International Studies Perspective and head of Department of Politics. He's the author or editor of 12 books. He is a Fulbright Senior Scholar, an honorary professor of the New Zealand Defence Command and Staff College, and provides regular contributions to the national and international media on global issues and events. His topic today is slightly changed from the one that was publicised, and it is, when I find it,
on the
it's
screen.
behind me on the board, for those that are awake. And those that can read it, and it's Brexit, the rewriting of history. I'll just wait for the auto cue to come up. And the erosion of democracy in the UK. Please welcome Robert Patman.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you. And first of all, I'd like to thank Kevin and his team for inviting me. It's always a real privilege and a pleasure to be here. And it's great to catch up with some old friends over lunch. Kevin, as well as Brian and Diane. Brian and Diane, they've known me since I've been in New Zealand. I think I arrived in middle of 91, exactly 30 years ago, as a young academic. And I think Brian heard me on the radio, and for my sins I was invited. And it was a great trip. First of all, I had a lot of difficulty finding Brian's farm. But the scenery just absolutely blew me away. And so it's great to catch up with Brian. Brian, of course, was very active as president of the New Zealand International Affairs branch of Timaru, and for many years. So we've got a long time association of friendship, and I'm delighted to be here. I want to talk, as Kevin indicated, about Brexit, the rewriting of history, and the erosion of democracy in the UK. And I apologise for the change of format. It's just that I realised it was on democracy somewhat late in the day, and I've orientated my talk. It actually is very complimentary to what I want to say, so it wasn't too much of a rejig. A striking... let me first of all just walk you through what I want to do today. Firstly, I want to talk about Brexit and the lessons, I put that in, of history, and I put that phrase in inverted commas because I think there's been some very distinctive lessons which the Brexiteers have claimed they have learned from history. And I want to walk you through some of the things that the Brexiteers claim makes Britain different from the rest of Europe. First of all, the question of the UK's geography. Secondly, the claim that the UK's identity is global, not European. Thirdly, the claim that the UK has a distinctive Second World War experience. And thirdly, and fourthly, this is an old favourite amongst the Brexiteers. If Winston Churchill was alive, he'd be a Brexiteer. I don't think so, but we'll have a look at that one. What does all this mean? I'm suggesting to you that I think the Brexit camp in the UK and now the Brexit government, have been quite creative in the way they've interpreted the past. Of course, they're not the first political group to do that. But I would argue, and I'll try and substantiate the argument with some details, that it's had serious, significant consequences for the integrity of UK political institutions and also for the policies that are now being adopted. The past is the only source of reference we often have. It's the only data we have for interpreting the present and the future. And if you are quite selective about the frame of reference you choose to operate from, that can have quite disastrous policy consequences. And finally, or penultimately, how did this all come about? And how have these reinterpretations of history been permitted? So that's our agenda for today. And I intend to speak. Like all academics, I will tell you in advance that I'm going to speak for 30 minutes and proceed to speak for 45. So. A striking feature of the Brexit camp's narrative in the UK, both before and after the 2016 referendum on EU membership, has been the repeated claim that leaving the EU is consistent with the lessons of history. Such lessons remain influential in the UK, but I would argue they invariably fail when they are put up to close examination. And I want to, as in the list here, I want you to walk through some of the lessons that many Brexiteers derive from history. This is their view of history, it's not mine, but I want you to be aware of it, because it might explain some of the things that are currently going on in the United Kingdom as I speak to you. Firstly is the question of the UK's geography. Advocates of Brexit contend the UK is physically separated from continental Europe and is an island state that looks to America as much as it does Europe. No one would dispute that Britain's an island state. Britain is an island state, but it's one that's been physically linked to France through the Channel Tunnel since 1994, and whose neighbours are European. And in fact, more than 50% of the British population, including my own family, has European ancestry. Including some of the Brexit leaders, like Mr Farage, for example, and Mr Johnson. So we mustn't overdo this sort of geographical remoteness on the part of Britain. Second, and not unrelated, it is claimed that Britain's identity is global rather than European. Nostalgic and selective memories of the British Empire loom very large here. Michael Gove, the current Minister for Boris Johnson's Cabinet Office, used his former position as Education Secretary to tweak the history curriculum at A-level or high school level in the UK to include the self-congratulatory theme of Britain's global impact in the 19th century. Gove wanted what's called in the United Kingdom A-level students to understand that anti-colonial revolts, he wanted them to understand them as disobedient mutinies under the new national history curriculum. There was some kickback, from not least from the people who taught history. But I just thought it was interesting. And we don't have to just rely on the Gove example. If you look at the speeches of many of the prominent people in the current government, if you look at the speeches of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and Dominic Raab, for example, the British Foreign Secretary, there is a clear longing to rekindle and deepen trade ties with Commonwealth nations to help replace those that it currently had, or it recently had, with the EU. But there is little evidence that the 51 Commonwealth countries are eager to rally around the UK and forge new ties with London. While in Britain, under the current government, while members of the current government may feel nostalgic about the British Empire, many former colonies don't share such happy memories. And the UK may discover similar sentiments as it now seeks to join the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Apparently it can't do business on its doorstep, but it needs to do business in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific. Third, the Brexit camp has repeatedly emphasised that Britain's experience during the Second World War has made the country different from and purportedly superior to other EU member states. A strong sense of British exceptionalism is in full bloom at the moment. It centres on the idea that Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany between 1939 and 1941 and relied on its Dunkirk spirit to resist Hitler until it was joined in this endeavour by the Soviet Union and the United States. But this account of Britain's wartime performance is highly selective. By the late 1930s, the British government was linking its own fate to that of Europe. Appeasement had been tried by the government led by Chamberlain and failed. In 1939, shortly after Churchill became leader, or in fact shortly before actually, the British declared war on Nazi Germany, not because it was attacked by Hitler's regime, but because the Nazis and the Soviets simultaneously invaded Poland, a country which Britain had pledged to defend its independence. Indeed, Winston Churchill recognised in 1940 Britain, as a European state, could never withdraw into some sort of, as he put it, island sanctuary. And it could not be indifferent to the fate of the European continent that was falling under Adolf Hitler's spell, or occupation actually. In other words, Churchill always saw the British security and economic needs as inextricably linked to Europe. And that takes me to the fourth point, the claim that if Winston Churchill had somehow survived on a diet of gin and tonics and God knows what, that he was still in full bloom, he would be a Brexiteer. They argue, the Brexit side argue, that Brexit is fully consistent with the foreign policy of Winston Churchill. Much of their claim centres on an observation that Churchill made in September 1946. Churchill said, immediately after the Second World War, and when he was out of office, he was no longer Prime Minister, quote, "We are with Europe, but not of it," unquote. That phrase has been repeatedly cited by the likes of Johnson and Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, as validation of their stance towards the EU. We'll return to that shortly. Boris Johnson likes to assume the Churchill mantle. He wrote a book, a biography of Churchill. He likes to assume the Churchillian mantle by frequently warning about a new form of menace on the continent. The European superstate, spearheaded by, you guessed it, Germany. Indeed, Jeremy Hunt, the former Conservative Foreign Secretary in 2018, compared the EU, a community of 27 liberal democracies, to the former Soviet Union. So it gets worse. There's a spectre of a German superstate emerging in the EU, and also the EU begins to resemble, apparently, the former Soviet Union. Actually, I think Mr. Hunt surpassed himself with that comment because he attracted considerable international ridicule. At the same time, the Leave side likes to point to Churchill's special relationship with the United States during the Second World War as a reason why it's not in Britain's interest to remain in the EU. But the use of the Winston Churchill analogy to support the Brexit case is thoroughly misleading. It was Churchill who advocated a United States of Europe in 1946, and his reasons for not joining in 1946 were tactical. As he pointed out, he was in the process of overseeing the disengagement of British colonial interests in a number of countries, such as India in 1947. Or rather, he wasn't doing it, his successor, Mr. Attlee, was doing it. But that's what Churchill said for a number of years, that Britain couldn't take on new responsibilities in Europe until it divested itself of some of its historical responsibilities to other countries which it had colonised. The point to note was, not only was Churchill a supporter of the United States of Europe, something he repeated in a very famous speech which he gave in Missouri, USA, alongside Harry Truman in March 1946. That's when he spoke about an iron curtain descending on Europe, and he was referring to the fact that the Soviet Red Army had occupied the whole of Eastern Europe and were establishing one-party states and authoritarian regimes. The other point to note is Churchill enthusiastically and very publicly endorsed the first British application to join what was then called the EEC, the Economic European Community, or the European Economic Community, in 1961. Nor is there any evidence that Churchill saw British membership of what was then called the EEC as an impediment to UK-US relations. If you think about it, since the United Kingdom has been in the European Union, British Prime Ministers have continued to have extremely, at least from the British end, extremely special relations with the United States. I think, as Helmut Schmidt once pointed out, however, it was a kind of a unilateral special relationship. It was very special to the British. I'm not quite so sure how special it was to the United States. So the EU has never been an impediment for British Prime Ministers to be chummy with their American counterparts. If you think about it, recent history has been deeply dominated, at least in British eyes, by Mr. Blair's relationship with Mr. Clinton, and then George W. Bush, and David Cameron was on quite pally terms with Barack Obama, etc., etc. All British Prime Ministers, since the UK's entry into the European Community in 1973, have continued to place considerable emphasis on the special relationship with Washington. Indeed, it was an American president, Barack Obama, who infuriated the Brexiteers in 2016, shortly before the referendum, by publicly observing that outside the EU, the UK would be less valuable to other countries and less able to fight for its own interests. Here, Obama was referring to the fact it's very difficult to shrink the size of your market from 550 million, as Britain was as part of the EU, to a market which it now is, 65 million. Most countries would readily concede that shrinking the size of your internal market is not necessary in your best interest. Not least because many countries used Britain, New Zealand's one of them, Japan's another, Canada's another, have used Britain as a gateway to the bigger EU market. And so those companies and countries which saw Britain as a gateway state no longer have that option. They face tough choices. Well, not so tough actually, because it comes down to whether they want to be in a market of 500 million people plus, or whether they want to be 1 in 65 million. For the big companies, they can have both. But not all companies are big. And some are making some choices. The Trump administration, of course, differed from that of the Obama administration. In fact, Mr. Trump claimed the credit for Brexit at the Scottish golf course. Immediately after the referendum, when the result came out, he wondered why it went down like a lead balloon with his host. Well, the whole of Scotland had voted to remain in the EU. Anyway, Mr. Trump had strongly backed Brexit, but interestingly, even the Trump administration, which advocated Brexit and said it was a great thing, made it clear that any free trade agreement with a post-Brexit UK would have to be consistent with America First principles. So you can imagine what sort of free trade agreement that would be. It certainly wouldn't be, how should I put it, one of equal measure. But if the Brexiteers' reading of history has been, I would argue, selective and flawed, and quite frankly, inaccurate, it has not only had it's not only had consequences for the integrity of British institutions, but also for the viability of democracy in the UK. Now let me explain that. The rewriting of history by the Brexiteers, and I've walked you through 4 examples, you could probably come up with 10. I've just picked on 4. This rewriting of history is an alarming sign, in my view, that of democratic erosion in the UK. Critics of these people who are trying to rewrite history have been tarred as unpatriotic or treasonous. The Brexit camp regularly refer to those who wanted to remain in the EU as traitors. This process of falsifying the past is not only polarising the United Kingdom, it's causing, not surprisingly, considerable friction with the UK's European neighbours. For many observers outside the UK, with some exceptions like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, 2 enthusiastic supporters of Brexit, it was always a stretch to claim that a 3.8% margin of victory, that's what they decided the referendum. The decision to leave the EU was decided on 3.8% margin of victory. Now, before the referendum, Nigel Farage said anything less than 4% was contestable. So he would have demanded another referendum had they lost by 3.8%. What's more, the referendum itself was legally non-binding. It was just purely advisory. The government had the opportunity to make it binding and they declined that opportunity. And yet, this referendum, in which 17.4 million people voted to leave the EU, in which 16.8 million voted to remain in, has been deemed sufficient justification for the greatest change in Britain's external policy since 1945. What's more, we now know the integrity of the EU referendum was tainted. And this is, I'm getting to my theme here, the erosion of democracy in the UK. In May 2018, Leave EU, which was one of the 2 major organisations campaigning for Britain to leave the European Union, Leave EU was spearheaded by Nigel Farage and bankrolled by someone called Aaron Banks. In May 2018, Leave EU was fined the maximum amount of £70,000 by the UK Electoral Commission, which is an independent institution which is designed to oversee elections in the UK. The reason it was fined this amount, £70,000, because it had exceeded its spending limit by 10%. Now just think about this. This is just one of the Leave participants kind of lobbying and campaigning to influence public opinion before the referendum. They spent 10% more illegally in an outcome that was decided by 3.8% of the popular vote. Then there was Vote Leave. This was a campaign group which was headed by Boris Johnson and our old friend Michael Gove. Vote Leave was fined by the independent UK Electoral Commission 61,000. They were referred to the police for serious breaches of electoral law. That police inquiry didn't come to anything. Nevertheless, these were huge electoral irregularities. Furthermore, the independent UK's Information Commissioner's Office fined Facebook £500,000 chicken feed to Facebook, that was the maximum possible fine under British law, for allowing improper use of millions of people's personal data by Cambridge Analytica, a company linked to Leave EU and Vote Leave, and has pursued a criminal prosecution of its parent company, SCL Elections, linked to a Canadian business that provided analysis for the Vote Leave campaign. So, let's sum up. There were massive breaches of electoral law. This was the greatest electoral law irregularities, according to one commentator, since the 19th century. There was also systemic data crime. Thirdly, the Leave camp was very friendly with the Russian embassy in London. There's growing evidence that Putin's Russia colluded with the Brexit camp to influence the outcome of the 2016 referendum. Aaron Banks and Nigel Farage seem to be quite friendly with the Russian embassy, and Mr. Banks did face an investigation to where Mr. Banks has made the greatest donation in British political history at that point, donated £8 million, and there was a suggestion, that hasn't been proved, that the money came from Moscow. The point to note here is that none of Mr. Banks's explanations for where he got the money have been particularly convincing. Although, to be fair, under the British law, he has not been found to have done anything wrong. What we do know is the Russian media were very supportive of the Brexit outcome, as they were, of course, with the election of Mr. Trump. Given the scale of these irregularities on many fronts, election skullduggery, deliberate overspending of a massive scale, information crime, systemic information data crime, strong suggestion of foreign interference. Given all these irregularities, the UK's failure to squarely address any of these issues, Mr. Johnson said it was a fair and free election and there was no suggestion of any irregularities, as he put it, not a sausage. Well, the UK Electoral Commission thought otherwise. I would argue that the biggest concern here is that the UK political system has not dealt with any of these problems since the 2016. The very least you would expect would have been a demand for the rerun of the referendum, where the outcome was so narrowly decided and there was massive evidence of wrongdoing. So British democracy has been significantly compromised. It's beginning to look a bit like a banana republic. The question is
if all this wrongdoing occurred, and it has, how have the Brexiteers managed to get away with rewriting the past and contributing to the decline of democracy? When Brexiteers said that Britain almost single-handedly defeated Hitler, why weren't they laughed out of court? The answer is that Boris Johnson, like his predecessors, Theresa May and David Cameron, have generally failed to distinguish between the internal party. They generally failed to distinguish between concerns about internal party unity and wider considerations of British national interests. In other words, for much of the Conservative Party leaders in the last decade have seen what's good for the Conservative Party as being good for the country. And therefore, Mrs. May squashed an attempt to investigate she actually blocked an investigation into Aaron Banks's financial connections. Also, Mr. Johnson suppressed a report which was highly embarrassing before the 2019 election called the Russia Report, which was produced by a bipartisan group of parliamentarians from the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is a bipartisan select committee. They produced, using intelligence sources, and showed, in the last decade, that report showed the Conservative Party had received huge amounts of money from Russian oligarchs who had very friendly relations with Mr. Putin. More than £3 million made its way into the Conservative coffers since 2010. You know, they say in politics there's no such thing as a free lunch. People don't just give you money because they're feeling generous. They normally want something in return. I don't think it was disinterested help. You can see why Mr. Johnson was very anxious for that report not to be published before the election. In fact, it was only published after the election by some smart footwork by the current members of the Parliamentary Intelligence and Select Committee. So it was despite Mr. Johnson's opposition that the report was published, and it's pretty devastating. Johnson's complicity has been aided, and when I say complicity, Mr. Johnson's willingness to go along with all this, not to order investigations into clear electoral breaches, not to look into mysterious donations which no one can really account for. This reluctance in which the rewriting of history in the UK and, sadly, considerable democratic erosion has occurred with alarming ease, and it could well get much worse in the not too distant future. Thank you very much for your attention.